My name is Dan Fisher. I'm from Oklahoma. I've been a pastor almost all of my life. I presently not only pastor, but I serve in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and I travel around the country telling the story of the pastors in the 18th century that the British called the Black Regiment. I am here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, speaking at a conference hosted by the Southwest Radio Church, and I am just preparing to go in here in a few moments and do my live presentation that literally I've taken all over the country. Now, there's a reason why I do this. Being a pastor is a full-time enough job for me, and then I add to it being a state representative. Wow, why would anybody want to do anything else? But over the years, I have learned the story of what the 18th century church did to fan the flames that ultimately birthed what we know of as these United States of America. A little known story, but it is so important. In fact, I grew up most of my life, I didn't know the story of the pivotal role that the church played in our War of Independence. It all began back with the First Great Awakening in the 1740s and 50s. Out of that came a revived church in the colonies. But there were also young men who grew up on the preaching of men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and those men had a fire that was lit inside of them, and they began to preach from Scripture about what God says when it comes to government. Most people think that the church shouldn't have anything to do with or say anything about when it comes to government, but actually government is one of the three institutions that God created so that we can have a civil society. Of course, you know the other two, the home and the church. So the home, the state, and the church. Well, these pastors didn't see the Bible as compartmentalizing people's lives into the secular and the sacred. They believe, to a believer, everything is sacred. So they preached from Scripture about government and the difference between a just government and tyranny. And of course, as the British stranglehold on the colonies continued to tighten, these pastors preached even more emphatically that the colonists needed to stand up for liberty and for the truth of the gospel, because they knew that if they didn't, and they allowed tyranny to go unchecked and unchallenged, eventually tyranny would place its sights on the church and the preaching of the gospel. So they knew this. Religious liberty was one of their primary motivations. So these pastors began 10 to 15 years, maybe 20, before the signing of the Declaration of Independence to preach these principles from their pulpits. Eventually, of course, it came to blows. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and these pastors literally began to recruit the men from their churches and lead those men off onto the battlefield and fight for liberty. Their story is simply phenomenal. One of the beautiful stories that I didn't know, the story of Paul Revere riding to Lexington on April the 18th, 1775. When he rides into Lexington yelling that the regulars are coming, he rides to a pastor's house. The pastor's name was Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark, along with the help of a deacon named John Parker, had been training the famous Lexington Minutemen. Who forgot to tell me in school that the famous Lexington Minutemen were trained and then led by a pastor and a deacon? That's exactly what happened. The next day, April the 19th, 1775, Pastor Jonas Clark, Deacon John Parker, led about 77 Lexington Minutemen, many of them members of Clark's church, out onto what was then the churchyard of Jonas Clark's church. And they stood up to the British. And of course, if you know your history, you know that the British fired the first shots. The Battle of Lexington was on, and our War of Independence had begun. Later on that afternoon in Concord, another preacher by the name of William Emerson, the grandfather of the famous poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, was at the Old North Bridge encouraging the colonists to fight. So this story is rich. These pastors were not rabble-rousers. These men were godly men. Many of them you may have even heard of but didn't know the connection. So that's why I go all over the country telling this story, because I believe that we are now at a moment very similar to the one they faced in 1776. I'm convinced that the church and ultimately the pulpit has let America down. We have not spoken on these issues, and now believers all over the country think it's wrong to mix politics and religion. The myth of separation of church and state is now believed as fact. If the church does not once again re-engage and begin to address the social ills of our culture from a biblical perspective, we're going to lose our liberties and ultimately probably see the gospel driven underground. We're not calling for war. No one's pulling out muskets wanting to pull triggers. We have a lot of political weapons in our arsenal if we'll use them. It's time for the church to stand up. That's the message of bringing back the black-robed regiment. Travel all over the country doing this story. If you're interested, I'd love for you to go to our website. Just go to danfisherbrr.com. That's our website. You can find all the information that you may seek. We'd be happy to talk with you, maybe even bring our live presentation to your community or to your church. God bless you. And in the words of Joab Trout, a preacher that was killed, a young preacher at the age of 25, killed at the Battle of Brandywine Creek after he'd preached a sermon the night before encouraging the troops. He ended his sermon with these words, God, prosper the cause. And that's what I'm praying today. God, prosper the cause of truth and liberty.